much, Mario, for the introduction. It's a big pleasure to be here again and to share a panel with Irene. Once again, we had the occasion of doing that last week. We have many issues of research in common. And it's also a pleasure to have a possibility to continue our exchanging of knowledge, expanding this discussion to the art terrain. And of course, I will show you a project, a public art project I curated for Itaú Cultural, which is a cultural institution here in Brazil supported by a bank. I did it in between 2008 and 2010, and of course, being a curator for a public art project, I don't forget that I am an architect, and I thought this project I created it considering this exchanging of infrastructure, territory, and public spaces in the city. That time, for that I did a big research and I could travel and visit many Brazilian cities, because the first thing is the title and the issue of the project is, it's called Margin. So, because of many reasons. Margin means the margins of the rivers, so the spaces alongside, beside the front rivers in Brazilian cities, but at the same time, spaces and cities that are marginalized in our history of colonization. So the hinterland, the interior of the continent, not the coast, not the littoral looking for Europe and United States. So, and I was based for this curatorial project in a book by the writer Euclides da Cunha, which the title is In the Margin of History. And this book looks to Amazon, interior of the country. Euclides da Cunha is the same writer who did the big book Sertões, the Savannah. So he was a writer, but at the same time a thinker about the territory. So this is an old map, a Dutch map, looking to South America, inverted, as you can see, and imagining this great lake in the heart of the continent, it idealized lake where could be the birth of all the rivers, so the paradise. And in some ways, this is the beginning of this research. So looking for the territory, at the same time I had the challenge to think a curatorial art project for the whole country. So how to integrate interventions in the territory, not to be isolated, thinking as a system of interconnections. So the rivers are also this possibility of thinking about the territory in interconnection of flows. And we have three big basins, our three major basins, the Rio São Francisco basin, the Amazon basin, and the Paraná Prata basin. So when we see in the map, we can clearly understand that they are almost connected. So it's the hydroanel in a bigger scale, right? The project was to understand the system of rivers in the continent, and I decided to choose some important points in terms of urban history and water basins. And I went to visit the cities and to understand their relationship with the rivers. In general, very bad relationships. Our historical urban development, unfortunately, every time considering the rivers as the backyard of the city and trash spaces. These are the maps of these 12 cities in the same scale, so considering the big differences of these rivers in Amazon, for example, or in São Paulo, the difference. And we did an exhibition in Itaú Cultural showing the result of this research I did and some proposals for the art interventions. First of all, I have to tell you, in the beginning we imagined to do 12 art projects, interventions. We did only one in São Paulo. It was let's say that the energy of the institutions ended up after the first, and the money also, they could realize that it was not so easy to do it, because Itaú Cultural, I think they, when they invited me to curate an art project, they had in mind the idea of sculptures in squares. So it's not. At the end, the bureaucracy, the problems of laws in the city and money, many difficulties. But it's nice to see. So we did only one, but it's a good example in terms of dealing with the city and trying to organize it. This is the map of, in a big scale on the ground, the continent. So I will show you some photos of these 12 cities, going there and trying to understand. Belém do Pará is one in Amazon region. In Belém do Pará is maybe one of the best situations in terms of relationships of the city with the river, a harbor area, and some parks connected in Rio Branco do Acre. Also, it's a poor city in Amazon, in a forgotten region of the country, but with some, at that moment, some experiences of municipality from the left doing works of urban projects, not very good, as you can see, but okay. So the margins of this Acre River is a public space. This is again Belém do Pará. They created a kind of open shopping mall alongside the river in a part. It's not also something that we like in terms of taste, and also but at the end, it's an open space where you can go and just relax and have the possibility of being in connection. The opposite is in Porto Alegre, is the same space, abandoned harbor area, but completely blocked and closed to public. They use it sometimes to Bienal do Mercosul, which is an important biennial of art. This occasion they open these spaces to art, but the other parts of the year every time closed. And there in Porto Alegre they have the train, so fences, walls, train and harbor. So it's a big obstacle, very difficult to see the river. The same thing in Manaus. Maybe Manaus is the worst case. In Manaus we are in the heart of Amazon, with the biggest river and beautiful in the world, and almost impossible to see the river. Walls blocking every time. And this is another very terrible, but at the same time interesting to see the situation in Recife, Pernambuco. I went to Recife many times. I never realized that there are such a big space in the heart of the city. But going to travel for this project, the first thing I did, that time in 2008, not like today, we have the smartphone with Google Maps. 2008, not. So arriving at the airport, I was going to the tourist information to have the map, to take the map of the city. And looking for the map, I realized big space, the meeting point of the 3 rivers in Recife and como dizer, pântano? Swamp, big swamp, yes. And but in the map is a green area, beautiful green area with the name Park. But when you so I saw, wow, there's a big park in Recife. I never realized that. Nice, let's go there. So going to the taxi drivers and saying, I want to go to this part. No, please, impossible. We cannot go there. So that's why I realized it's the biggest swamp park in South America, urban park in South America, but with favela and danger space. But of course, danger because in terms of the future I imagine for this part. So the real estate market in Recife is particularly aggressive, and the possibility of erasing all of these people and doing a rich condominium in the future, I think, so it's something to think about. And Manaus again. This is the only part when we see the Amazon River, the Rio Negro, Black River. You see, and this is the connection of the old market Art Nouveau building, beautiful but abandoned, and trash, and the city center. All another parts of Manaus drying the rivers to urbanize everything. So it's a nightmare. Porto Velho was the end of this train line built by the Americans in the late 90s. The idea at that moment was to do by train the possibility of transport that was impossible by river because of the waterfalls. So they created, it was an important project for developing infrastructure in the country, but it's completely abandoned, and the rain forest growing around. This is again Recife. So they say in Recife because this is the como é Foz mesmo? Mouth, the mouth of Capibariba River, and they say this is the birth of the Atlantic Ocean.
Aspirational.
Yes. So there we see the sculptures, the park of sculptures this side, and the other side, the Twin Towers they built recently, completely out of laws. That's why I said it's aggressive. So transforming completely the skyline of the city center. It's a colonial city. And in Belém do Pará, I said it's a kind of good relationship of the city and the rivers, but there is 7 kilometers extension between the end of the old historical city and the university that was occupied by small harbor area and favelas, And at that time when I was there, they were in process of expelling people, erasing everything, and starting the construction of big, rich condominiums and gated communities alongside the river. That's why I realized at that moment, 2009, that we were in a very special moment in Brazil in terms of decision of what to do with these river coasts. Because in the process of sustainability, water problems, and the real estate market, seeing that these forgotten areas of urbanized areas in Brazil now are the best choice for real estate market to occupy. And our public power was not seeing it so clearly. So we were and we are in a danger moment of struggle to rethink these areas as public and defending this agenda. That's why I decided to do this public art project, because I think art is an important tool of reaction and criticizing, creating possibility of thinking. Even in Porto Alegre, seeing restorations of public spaces supported by private companies, so this process of appropriation of the private these areas, even in good cases like that. So for São Paulo, which would be the first art project, and it was the only one, I decided to invite Héctor Zamora, a Mexican-born artist who was living in Brazil at that moment. He lived here for 10 years, I think. Now he's living in Lisbon. But his first important art project was that in Mexico City, in Carrillo Hill Museum. He was very young at that moment, and he was invited to as an artist, a visitor artist, so to do workshops and to be there in this museum for 1 month, exchanging knowledge with people. So like a visiting art, he decided to understand it literally, and he proposed, okay, I'm a visiting artist, so I will live here in the museum. My proposal for you is to build my house in the museum. This is the first sketches of that, and this is the work under construction, like a bubble prosthesis in the facade of the concrete facade of the museum. You see, it's a big house. Yes. And the name of the work is Paracaidista. Paracaidista in Spanish, I'm not sure if it is in all of the Spanish language countries, but in Mexico it is parachute. Paracaidista means parachute, of course, but also invader. And the one who lives in favela, because it's occupying a space that not belongs to you. So the title of the work, connections with this idea. This is the house. Not so easy, yeah, to build, because of course there were not much money. They did it with some friends helping to do it as a collective work, and not with engineers and all of that, so a bit danger, but it was okay. This is the house inside, and I like a lot this possibility of crossing public and private. So this is the most important
No, sorry, which museum?
Carrillo Hill, Mexico. Carrillo Hill.
It's not a permanent house, no.
No, it was for only 2 months.
2 months.
Yeah.
Wow.
1 month more than they were expecting in the beginning. But living there, for example, on Sundays, having the possibility of lunch with friends, to barbecue with friends, going there and going from inside the museum,
Yeah.
bringing food to do it. So this was really a fantastic possibility. And for me, having the possibility of knowing that, I thought, this is the guy, right? To work with me for this project, to do a radical work in São Paulo, aggressive in this sense. Because to do something in São Paulo, you have to be aggressive. The scale and the ugliness and all the things that you have to deal working in São Paulo. Here is a map of São Paulo with our major rivers, and in the middle we have the river we elected to work is Tamanduateí. Tamanduateí is the river closest to the city center, to the historical beginning of the city. This is Pinheiros River. This is a fantastic photo of the transformation of the landscape. And this is the Tamanduateí River in the late 19th century. Crossing to the east. So Tamanduateí River is the border of the city center going to the east, which is a part of industries, factories, and the development of the labor work class in São Paulo. This is Tietê River. It's a scene that we see many times. So this photo is here to remind us of what happened with the sacrifice of nature in our urban landscape. If you are in a boat in Tietê, look into the canals, we see this kind of infrastructure landscape, sometimes people living under bridges, typical what in anthropology we call no places. This marginalized spaces alongside infrastructure and animals. Yes. Incredible, they resist, they are there. Looking from above, this is the meeting point of the Tamanduateí River with Tietê. In a triangle, it's a super special place in the geography of the city, but it's a place that we never see. We don't realize when we are there because we are there only by car, and this is a mess. But when we are in a boat, but we never are in a boat, right? It's just a special moment I could do. Me and Hector, we did a boat trip to this research, but this is looking to this point. And here we are looking to the Tamanduateí River, which is completely urbanized and canalized, and it's a sewer, it's dirty. But we decided to go back to the birth of Tamanduateí River, which is not far from São Paulo. And it is in Mauá, it's in the big metropolitan area of São Paulo. And going there, looking for this, the birth of the river, we could see also this big pool, we call it in Portuguese. It's a reservoir of water with the Tamanduateí River water, and they created there a space for fishing. So a small community, neighborhood, old people going there, but of course, just for fun. You cannot eat animals. I wouldn't call it fish, but this is the place, you see, very close to Avenida do Estado, to a highway. Impressive to see the possibility of regeneration of landscape and transforming. And this is the park in Mauá. Going there, it's a beautiful place with this mist in the morning, like a miracle. Going to see the very birth of the Tamanduateí River, could drink it. So we did it in a cave, but going back after just going out of the park, this is the Tamanduateí River being polluted and the beginning of the tragedy. So going back, this is the avenue, Avenida do Estado, and the Tamanduateí River goes alongside this expressway with bus on above. This is a bus line, and this is the technical landscape we have here. Now this building doesn't exist anymore. The municipality decided to destroy it because it was a kind of vertical favela. Alexandre likes a lot. Maybe after you can explain to us more about this drawing. This is the first market, and of course this region was the harbor of the city, so the boats arriving and market of food, very important in the region of the city. And also women going there to wash the clothes, so it was like the end of the city. But in the beginning of the 20th century, we built Parque Dom Pedro. When we see these photos, is impressive because it looks like Europe or United States. And then in the winter, these trees, the possibility of grass and public space in São Paulo, we cannot believe it happened. But now the Parque Dom Pedro doesn't exist anymore. It's remains of grass and fences and viaducts and expressways, and it's just a name in the map, Parque Dom Pedro. And Hector, for this project, we decided to work with this river. We did these 3 researches, and in the beginning, the first idea of Hector was to work with this tall building that after was destroyed, and it was abandoned but occupied by paracaidistas. And his first idea was to build a 5-star hotel on the top of this building, where you could just arrive by a helicopter. These are the sketches, but of course it was impossible to develop. It was just an input of starting to the reflection to think about. And after came this final proposal. The title of the work is Errand. 10 big trees floating over the river with iron cables as a kind of surrealistic landscape. It happened for 2 months, and so I'm really happy to be part of it. So as I told you, we had to do something aggressive and violent that could correspond to the aggressiveness and the scale of the city. And as you can see, it was not exactly an artwork that we can consider ecologist. It was more, when we see these trees, they were there like, we think about sickness and ghosts. So they were more like reminding us that this is a ghost park and a ghost river. Trashes all around the space. You can imagine how it was the vernissage of this exhibition. the art audience going to this vernissage, surrealistic situation. The bank, Itaú Cultural, was giving us champagne to drink, and people going out with these glasses of champagne in the middle of this violent space. And at the end, I like this photo. I took this photo in the morning, and I was trying to imagine what happened to this man when he woke up after this moment. Because people living on the streets, probably drinking a lot, and waking up and looking around and seeing some trees floating, and thinking, maybe I drank so much, it's not true. But that's the point. What I wanted to do with Hector, we wanted to do with this project was to create a possibility of thinking about our cities, the margin of the rivers, the relationship between urbanization and nature and landscape, and also dealing with the possibility of creating what Freud calls uncanny, and Fiedler developed it in architecture, but the possibility of strangeness in what is familiar. That's the point. We live in this surrealistic city. We never think about this surrealism, and because it's familiar for us. Every day, it's the everyday life in these spaces. But the art is a tool that can bring some strangeness for it, and the possibility of looking it from outside. That's the point. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here and to Siga-nos. So muito feliz de estar com vocês, and also to hear a little bit more about how this project developed, because I think I spoke with Mario when I first arrived at Princeton in 2012. And this project was just starting. And Mario asked me today to speak about Blind Field, which was a project that I was just developing at the time. It's an exhibition that I curated and co-curated with Tamila Mosaka. It opened in 2013 at the Krannert Museum at the University of Illinois, which is where I was teaching the 3 years prior. And the exhibition took up this idea of blindness as a critical category, a metaphor for the ways in which the obstruction of perception can illuminate alternate models of knowledge and experience. I think this has a lot to do with this notion of estrangement. Blindness is, of course, a kind of estrangement in itself. And I had come to be involved with Brazilian contemporary art through my historical research on Eloy Tessica, the artist that you see here. So I had come to Brazil many, many times in the process of this historical research, and had become close with a number of artists, including Hector, young artists who at that time had actually not been shown abroad. And what was interesting to me was that in the United States, the contemporary artists that were being shown all the time had a kind of very calcified and stereotypical notion of Brazil that was being put forward. And the discussions that I was privy to were much more conceptual, which were much more interesting, very sophisticated discussions about art. And they were also transnational. Hector is a Mexican artist working in Brazil. There are many other artists who are working in places like São Paulo and Rio and Recife, which were really cosmopolitan centers. And so when it came to us, the idea to make an exhibition of emerging artists working in Brazil, we were very specific about the idea that it would not be a Brazilian art exhibition, but rather thinking about these places as very important sites of contemporary practice. So the paradox of blindness was something that is both very internal to some of these discussions, this is more related to Siga, and also indicative of some of the contradictions of global existence, particularly the paradox of so-called underdevelopment at large. Another important contextual note, Tumelo Masaka, my co-curator, and I arrived at the University of Illinois in January of 2009. So this is right on the heels of the global financial crisis of 2008. And here you see this article from The Guardian, Saturday, the 10th of May, 2008, "The country of the future finally arrives." And this, of course, notes that Brazil, unlike many other countries, weathered the global financial crisis and came out very, very strong. And this article notes, these new oil fields that had been discovered, as well as the success of initiatives like the Bolsa Familia, which really pushed a large number of poor into the working class, which was very important. Now, thinking about this in 2017, it almost seems ridiculous, right? We are living in this shockingly different cultural moment, both in Brazil and the United States, globally. But I think in some ways, this organizing metaphor of blindness still is important, albeit with very different reflections. And I think it's important here to note that this aphorism that is used so often to speak up about Brazil, Brazil is the country of the future, the full phrase is Brazil is the country of the future and will always be. So there's a deferment, a failure that is inherent to the very idea of progress. The other important thing was that Jorge Paulo Leme, who's a huge Brazilian Swiss businessman, had just started an Institute of Brazilian Studies at the University of Illinois when I arrived. And there was a huge focus on the economy, on business. And one of the things that we wanted to do in our exhibition was to complicate the kind of euphoria that was accompanying this idea that this country of the future had finally arrived. And we wanted to look at what these contemporary artists were doing in their studios. Many artists were responding very much to this construction boom that was happening around this time, 2008, 9, 10, in cities like São Paulo. But because of this aggressive real estate market, it was happening in very inconsistent ways. There was a lot of speculation. Buildings were rising as ruins. This is something that Robert Smithson, the American artist, had written about in the 1960s. And Smithson was an artist that many of the artists I was in touch with were thinking about in very interesting ways. So the relationship between construction and markets was the kind of first theme that emerged. This is a work by a Spanish artist, Daniel Stigman-Magdalene, called Economic Dune, Model Without Quality. He was living in Rio, and this is made of fiberglass and sand, and you can see it's suspended in this kind of metal matrix. And it becomes a sort of material metaphor for the inconsistency and the flux of global markets. It's scaleless. We don't really understand to what coordinates it corresponds, but of course it interacts with our own perception, our own circulation within the space. Stigman-Magdalene was also interested in exploring the constructedness of nature. And on the left, this is an exhibition shot from our exhibition. You see there his economic dune. And the relationship between nature, and constructiveness, artifice, culture. This was the second kind of major theme that emerged in our visits with artists. You see here Héctor Zamora's project Errant, which we included in our show. And also on the bottom, an image from a work by Thiago Rocha Pita, a Brazilian artist, called Double Fountain or Cooked Landscape. And this records an intervention that the artist made in this landscape and filmed. The intervention was to burn leaves at coordinated intervals immediately above this waterfall. So it creates a kind of inversion in smoke of the waterfall that falls beneath it. So he's interested in questions of material conversion, but of course it's never a perfect conversion because it is smoke, not steam, right? And when we look at this, this is a kind of intervention that is created without the ability of seeing it oneself. He's deep in the cooking the leaves. It's recorded by the monocular view of the camera, but of course we interact with it through a binocular phenomenological view. So there's these series of inversions that never quite make a perfect mirror that he was interested in here. I won't go over Hector's work, but this is just to show, this is how we displayed it in our exhibition. And I think it's a really amazing work, and it's such a privilege to hear you get to talk about it because I don't think we had met at the time then. This is another work by an artist called Andrei Komatsu. It's called Money Talks from 2011. And one of the things that's sort of, key to this question of nature and culture is, of course, the ways in which natural resources become capital, the ways in which they're mobilized within various types of representation and use. And here, what Komatsu has done is to create this kind of scaffold with these ordinary construction materials, and they become a place to display piles of sugar, salt, coffee, iron, and a cup of oil. And all of these commodities were key to Brazilian wealth, the creation of wealth and capital at different points in its history. So like economic dune, there's a metaphoric element that's also very material. Commodities are, of course, defined by their exchange value. So at any moment when you understand exchange value, there's, of course, a dematerialization that happens. And Komatsu gestures to the kind of phantasmagoric aspect of this dematerialization in this little film that is projected here. And you have this kind of flickering drawing. And it reminds us that commodities, wealth, boom and bust are all produced in and through representation. And of course, in the wake of 2008, this was very much present and urgent. So the question of illusion, what is displayed, what is obscured, this became the kind of third central anchor for our exhibition. Again, the emphasis was on materiality, but the way in which materiality encodes and produces illusion. These are two exhibition shots. The work here is a site-specific installation by an Argentine artist named Nicolas Romeo, who's working in São Paulo. It's specific to its site. So you have a semblance of a window that's throwing light on the wall, but the mechanism is, of course, revealed to you. This is also interesting because obsolete technology for my generation and the generation of these artists was the first interaction we had pedagogically. When we first went to school, this is how things were conveyed to us. But it becomes a sculptural element in its own right. This piece here is a work by Marcelo Cidade. It's called Surface Model, and it's a photograph, a black and white photograph of a chipboard plank that exactly covers the surface of this same plank. So the sign and the referent appear to coincide, but of course they can't, because by covering the actual chipboard with the photograph, you're fundamentally changing it and denying access, visual access to it. Chipboard is one of the cheapest construction materials, and Cidade is very interested in the ways in which representation, the whole mechanism of art, the circuit of art, is a way in which objects are transformed in value. So art becomes a kind of mini testing ground for the productions of capital and speculation that happen at large. This is a video here by Tatiana Blas. This is called Deceit is the Luck of the Contented. And this is a really fantastic video. You have sort of two figures here. There's only one here. There's a woman she expounds through discourse the merits of the absurd. And then on her side, you don't see him here, but this right here is a magician's stage. And so there's a magician who does all these tricks, but without speaking at all. And they stand in this abandoned lot in São Paulo. And one of the lines that I love that the female performer says is, "Fiction will be effectively lived. It will not come from the mind. It will be raw, concrete matter, leaving no doubts to its presence." But of course, you know, she's saying this in discourse, and meanwhile you have the magician who is dematerializing all the time matter. So these were the kind of three linked areas of research or investigation, let's say, that we saw at artist studios at the time. Construction, urban shifts and markets, a rethinking of the natural in terms of construction and intervention, and the question of materiality and illusion. Now, as we were doing this research, one of the things that was really a kind of marked experience for someone who's coming, I mean, I think for everybody living in São Paulo, but especially someone from coming abroad, was the Cidade Limpa Act of 2007, Clean City Act, which outlawed urban advertising like billboards and marquees in an attempt to control this visual pollution. So all of a sudden, a city that had been, you know, literally papered with commercial solicitation became one of these blank spaces. Here, this is across from the Pinacoteca, of these kind of inadvertent monochromes. These are pictures that I took. This is crossing, of course, from the Biennale to the Duração building. And for someone, an art historian like me, who's obsessed with the history of the monochrome, this was very impressionante for me. But also uncanny to go back to this question, because of course the clean city law did not mean that the city became clean, but rather that it was ghosted with a residue of this commercial solicitation. Also, historically speaking, there was a much more radical displacement that was at work, namely that the so-called public spaces that the clean city law was trying to protect had already migrated, right, to computer screens, other forms of solicitation and the capture of capital. So in this sense, the kind of blankness of some of these billboards had this double register, in the sense that they indexed a past potentiality that has become obsolete, and the speculation of a future potentiality that continues very much in the ideological vein from before. ¿Da para entender? Okay. So, for us, when we came to these photographs, this was the kind of crystallization of everything. These are photographs made by two artists, Claudia Moraes and Carolina Cordeiro, and they were called Campo Cego, or Blind Field. And this is when we decided, you know, this is the name of the exhibition. These are photographs. Both of these artists are from Minas Gerais, General Mines. And so the dirt in this area is very rich. And so the accumulated dust that covers road signs creates, again, these sort of inadvertent monochromes. But here's an aggressivity of so-called nature rewriting and making illegible the very mechanism by which we are meant to negotiate the landscape, right? So if you can't see where you're going on the highway, you have to stop. And so there's various kinds of temporality at work. This slow aggressivity of nature here makes it impossible to travel at the velocity one would imagine. So this suggested to us ways to reimagine the possibility of negotiating a given landscape, but also re-seeing from an oblique point of view. These are the photographs installed in our exhibition. As we investigated this mission of the blind field, we learned that it had also been used by the French sociologist and philosopher Henri Lefebvre. In 1970, he published a book called Urban Revolution, and he described a blind field as a transitional zone that lies between various elements of socioeconomic production. So Lefebvre essentially here describes the agricultural, the industrial, and what he called the urban. And the urban really corresponds more or less to the kind of global megalopolis that we know now. The blind field for Lefebvre is a point of transition between these modes, but because it's a point of transition, it escapes legibility, it escapes comprehension. So it's between ideological paradigms. And so this is just a quote here. The blinding is the luminous source, knowledge, or ideology that projects the beam of light that illuminates elsewhere. The blinded is our dazed stare, as well as the region left in shadow. On the one hand, a path is open to exploration. On the other hand, is an enclosure to break out of, a consecration to transgress. So the blind field isolates what we do not know yet in any process of historical transition. But rather than point our attention to what is ahead of us, this kind of myth of progress, the country of the future has always arrived, it points us to what remains imperceptible. And it allows this transition to be worked over experientially, aesthetically, physically, politically, and this, for us, is what we understood to be the primary work of the work of art. So just to explain how this works a little bit more concretely, along these two walls here is what has now become a very famous work by the Brazilian artist Dr.ª. It's called Ressaca Tropical, or Tropical Hangover. But Ressaca is also the motion of the waves when it hits the beach. And Jonathas was very interested in how history and memory are produced through various kinds of archives, intimate archives, historical archives, and specifically the city of Recife, where he lives. And this work is structured around a diary that Jonathas found, an anonymous diary he found in the trash, essentially, which recounts the life of a person who lived in Recife during the 1970s, which is, of course, the most repressive years of dictatorship. And, you know, if you read the diary, it's not actually that interesting. It kind of toggles between these erotic encounters, which he never describes in much detail, but just that they happened, and this kind of endless process of going to various institutions to get stamps or to get papers from one thing or another. Last year I had a Bolsa FAUUSP, and so now I understand intimately Brazilian democracy, bureaucracy. Bureaucracy. And so what Jonathas did was to line up this diary, the pages from this diary, with archives from 4 different institutions, or one of them is just his own personal archive. One is an official archive of the city, which, for example, treats modernist architecture at the moment. Another is by a different, another individual, which is a private citizen. And so the kind of ambiguous nature of this project comes into dialogue with these possible histories, ways in which we might understand Recife. I think it's important to note, as Guilherme mentioned, that Recife is a place of rampant speculation in terms of the real estate market. So the very history of the urban texture of Recife is constantly being rewritten. It's also the home of Dr.ª, one of the most important sort of ideologues of Brazilian racial democracy and what is Brazil. So basically he's treating these kind of transitional moments of Recife's urbanization as a blind field to be reactivated. I'm going to skip over a couple of things here. These are all artists that are included in the show. There's one thing that I wanted to mention that I think is important, is that the works that we chose really moved between quite abstract phenomenological pieces and works that were more figurative and in some cases political. This piece here is a work by Marcel Salman, and it's created simply by using paint and a kind of wax on the floor that changes it so it makes it look like it's glass. Of course, it's not. This is my baby at the time, crawling out of this space. And this could be understood as a completely formal exercise, but because it takes part of the institutional structure, and it literally changes the institutional structure in the sense that the wall becomes a part of the work, that interface, the institutional interface, is something that we start to have to understand in our own relation. And the museum that we were working with was attached to all of the educational classrooms. And so the museum and the university were really one here. And so to think about the kind of disciplinary nature of those two spaces, I think was important. We installed that next to a piece by Graziella Kunsch, who's an USP graduate. She's an artist and an activist, and this is part of a project she calls Projeto Mutirão. Mutirão means sort of participatory mutual aid, and what she does is to collect videos that contain elements of a mutirão. And she has also been very involved in both the free housing and free transport movements. The free transport movement, of course, was very key for the 2013 manifestations here in Brazil. And she uses these clips as a way to involve conversations about social justice. And so every time the piece is presented, she herself comes to the site, creates a conversation with people that is in turn filmed. So there's a kind of internal feedback that occurs here. You can't see her, but she's here at the University of Illinois. This is me carrying Skype from Princeton. Now, Mario asked me to make just a couple comments about the last São Paulo Bienal and ways to sort of think about these continuing issues. This was the São Paulo Bienal of 2016. It was called Incerteza Viva. It's curated by a team led by Jochen Volz. And Volz was interested in the kind of radical uncertainty that pervades contemporary existence, the kind of real precarity of our environment in terms of political, economic, cultural, and really environmental systems. And one of the most important strategies that Volz used was to think of the garden as a kind of conceptual and curatorial tool. This sounds kind of, the garden seems to be, maybe it's not quite an aggressive metaphor, but when you start to think about what a garden is, it is the artificial organization of the natural. And so the garden inflects, in some ways, all of our interventions in our environment. At the same time, the garden suggests an entity that has a dynamic, ecological, material, aesthetic, and temporal relation. Here is the kind of opening installation that you would see when you walked into the Biennale. It's made by the Polish-Brazilian artist Franz Krachberg, who is in his 90s and actually was an art handler at the very first São Paulo Biennale of 1951. So, and over the course of the last, I'm not sure how many...
Franz Krachberg.
Krachberg, yeah. Sorry to say, no, sorry. Krachberg. Over the course of several biennales, curators have tried to open up this interface between the Biennale building, which is of course a modernist icon, and the Parque, which stands in many ways for public space in São Paulo. And this barrier is one that is heavily policed in an economic sense, sometimes physically, by security. And Jochen Volz was the first curator who was able to actually open up this barrier so that there's free passage from the park into the kind of interior garden of the Biennale. One of the things that I also thought was quite useful about the garden as a curatorial and conceptual tool is the way it allows us to think about the scalar relationality of works within a given exhibition, and then how this in turn inflects their aesthetic, historical, and critical capacity. And I just thought I would give one example here This is a work by Lais Mira, who's one of the artists that we included in Blind Field, who's very interested in the legacy of modernism and its failures. She's the first woman artist to also occupy this particular space in the Biennale, which is kind of the space because it's of course the biggest and her work can be seen from all levels. It's called Dois Pesos, Duas Medidas, which literally in English would be two weights, two measures, but she translated it as double standard, which I think is very important. Yeah, and you can see it's these two monumental towers, which are constructed from very different materials. One is built from materials from the standardized building industry, so you have cement, glass, brick, so on. The one that's next to it is constructed from indigenous indigenous building practices, so straw, bamboo, wood, earth, and so on. So these two columns literally have different weights. This one is, of course, much heavier, and it's much heavier in terms of its, its so-called success ideologically. So they imply various temporalities. But when you start to think about them, they start to become a little bit less stable. One would think that this column carries with it a certain sense of permanence, but it's actually the other one that has the possibility of imagining a regenerative possibility of architecture in which we might actually, sustain our life on this earth. I do think that the sculpture has the possibility of being extremely overdetermined in the sense of its monumentality. You can understand this as a kind of autonomous sculpture, one that you might put in a public park as an example of public space. But what I think is important is that once we start to understand it by virtue of a kind of curatorial practice of the garden in relationship to a scalar interrelationality with art, it becomes much more flexible and dynamic, I think, as a critical and aesthetic position. So what I wanted to do was to show a little clip from a work that had been installed essentially in a series of video rooms right here, right next to this. And these were a series of short films made by the Brazilian filmmaker, documentary filmmaker Leon Hersman in the mid-1970s. And the aim of these documentaries was to record the songs that were sung by rural laborers that seemed like they were on the edge of disappearance. And Hersman and other cultural workers at the time saw these songs as a form of popular resistance to the implementation of a totalized industrialized capital. And so the clip that I wanted to show you includes footage of a mutirão. So again, this form of participatory self-aid. In English, we might call it like a house raising. It doesn't always have to be in relationship to habitation, but it often is. So I'll just play you a couple minutes here. It's not disponible.
You need internet for it?
Yeah. Is it possible to connect the computer to the internet? But we can actually even search for it online. Yeah, if you just look up Leon.
Actually, I'm not connected. Sorry. No, I'm not connected. How do you connect here?
I need to.
What's the platform? You need
They have to give you. I think the computer is connected.
Yeah. I'm seeing if I can get it.
You think it's connected? Yeah. Eles não têm habilitado no computador, né? Talvez possa usar a internet mesmo.
essa é a primeira. E a gente vai começar em 7 minutos. 7. Isso.
Tem som? Tem som?
Tem som. Yeah, that's fine. I just want to show while we're waiting for that. So what we're going to see is a mutirão that's in a rural village. But what I think is interesting, these are photographs that myself and my students took last year when we were here in São Paulo. We were invited by an activist to come to an occupation of a building in 9 de Julho, which was occupied along with several other buildings the night before. And they were in the process of doing a mutirão, of cleaning this abandoned building so that it could be lived in. Lais Mira's work, once the Biennale ended, the material was donated. And so although there's what seems to be an ideological division between the industrialized and the indigenous, which might have a kind of moral inflection, I think what we can understand is that the mutirão also has changed an inflection and moved perhaps, deep into this urban center. So agora a gente vai. That we visited last year is now actually going to participate in the next São Paulo Biennale of Architecture.
Next year?
Yeah, I just read this a couple of days ago. And so I think it's quite interesting. In fact, one of the narrators for these films was Ferreira Goulart, who in the 1950s, the late 1950s, was the advocate of avant-garde criticism, for example, of neo-concretism, which is the movement that I study myself, and a kind of core of what we understand as the constructive avant-garde of Brazil. And so I think, to think about these various ways in which the constructive can be rethought is something quite interesting, at least in this series of relations.
Okay, well, I had prepared some comments, not fully knowing where the two presentations would coalesce, and they actually coalesce very nicely in different ways. So bear with me in the sense of, I think part of what I wanted to do was to maybe, on the one hand, expand this question of perception, which I think today has largely kind of occupied both the sense of kind of the occupation that's entailed when bodies occupy urban space, which we saw many photographs of in Guillermo's presentation, but also the sense of, I think, the visible and the invisible, a kind of visual sense of perception, which I think also in the different examples of these kind of investigations of the kind of materiality of capital in a way, or its dematerialization, also started to kind of complicate themselves beyond the visual register. So something I was interested in and just knowing a bit ahead of time about what you both were going to talk about was this question of, that I think Jeremy raised very explicitly, which is the way in which water is made public, which is something we've talked about in past workshops in different ways. So I say that water is made public because I think as an infrastructure, as a kind of shared resource, it's something that we're always, I think, historically and contemporarily figuring out, struggling over about how to manage it, access and consume it, and in whose interest that happens. So given the pressure of privatization, which we talked about in the context of the margins of today, as well as over the distribution and access to water, the public value of water, as I think we can all agree, is not necessarily guaranteed. It has to be made and defended in a way. And I think throughout the past few workshops, we've seen different examples of how that happens. In workshop 3, we learned about the work of planners, regional planners who really think at a larger scale, the kind of optic of the aerial view in a way, but also the kind of technical work of infrastructure. But here it was implied that kind of water is needed as a public resource in order to maintain the viability of private capital, for instance, in the New York region. In workshop 4, we learned about practices of advocacy and activism over the ownership and management of beaches, rivers, and groundwater in Los Angeles. And such practices, as we learned, mounted a defense of public land and of water that residents of Los Angeles consume but never see, as in the case of groundwater. We also learned, and through a number of examples in workshop 3 and 4, about how the practice of architectural drawing brought into greater focus the ways that water ties together different scales and actors. So I was thinking of the drawings of Paulo Mendes de Rocha, also the section, sorry because I know you haven't seen these, Irene, but there was a section that Angelo sent us, I think in your absence, of the city of São Paulo. And so here I think water stands out as a kind of common datum on which everything else is constructed at kind of degree 0. And in a sense, in that section, I don't remember kind of seeing water explicitly, but in a sense the implication was that it shaped everything in that landscape in a way of this kind of cross-section of São Paulo in which you see not only buildings, but this particular geography of the city. And I think, and finally, as we learned about in our engagement with student projects last fall, settlement practices along the periphery of São Paulo continue to claim the edges of water bodies as their own. When we talk, for instance, about the politics of sediment and settlement, and the way in which sediment accumulates in some of the lakes on the periphery of São Paulo, and how that also becomes a space in which different populations actually make claims to urban space. So in a sense, each of these practices, ranging from lived experience to advocacy, presents their own idea of how water is made public. Not to mention that they imagine different publics and communities that claim water in surrounding spaces. So I think part of making water public and kind of bringing it kind of into visibility as a matter of public concern is getting people to care about it. And one of the questions I have today is how art activism or even architecture gets people to care about water, to sympathize, for instance, with how others are affected by water or in need of it. Flooding, for instance, which has been a kind of constant and I'd say a persistent issue in the kind of political imagination of infrastructure in the United States, even recently with the flooding in Houston. The flooding is never experienced equally by all, and that in a sense getting recognition for how it impacts people demands a certain degree of empathy, or for people to feel sympathetic with the experience of other people, many of whom are strangers. This can be a challenge, I think, for something like water, which can implicate large-scale networks and distant strangers. I think that the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, for instance, and Detroit has made that visible, in the sense that in many respects, this kind of question of lead and the contamination of water, it implicates scales that really kind of even go beyond the particular boundaries of Flint and Detroit. I mean, in a sense, it implicates the whole kind of region of the upper Midwest and kind of deindustrializing spaces in the United States. So what interests me here is that despite the solidarity about water, it can start with something as intimate as the body. As a water activist in Buffalo, where I once lived some years back, reminded me, as residents of that city in New York, which is adjacent to Lake Erie, one of the Great Lakes, we are Lake Erie. Buffalo's water supply comes from Lake Erie. All of that water that we drink from the lake is in us. It stays with us. In a sense, was what she was trying to get us to think about. It's literally our body content. Whether we like it or not, water is already something that we feel together, however difficult that experience of the common might be to recognize or perceive. Perhaps the challenge is to make visible the ways that water is already felt or seen, as in this case, or something that people already care a great deal about, in a sense where it's already contested or made public. So, another way of thinking about this is that to make water public, we might also question who controls the infrastructure of water. So its kind of pipes, even its water pressure. So for instance, as anthropologist Nikhil Anand has observed of water networks in Mumbai, changes in water pressure are highly political occurrences and are sometimes manipulated by the poor, who otherwise don't have access to regular water supply. So here the idea of water as a common or public resource is contested by struggles over its distribution. So indeed, I think in this context, the very idea of the public is questioned because it all too often excludes the poor in a place like Mumbai, or even in Flint or Detroit or many other places in the world today. So I think on a bit of a different register, Guillermo and Irene have shown us perhaps a different kind of politics, not so much a politics of the way in which water is kind of embodied or shared in this kind of sensorial or bodily register, although maybe this is something we can talk about more. But a kind of interesting intersection between the two papers is, I think, a question of the politics of occupation, which I think really dovetails with the concerns of the Fluvial Metropolis project about thinking about water also as a series of spaces in the city. And in a sense, how different forms of occupation disrupt our perception of urban life. Here, what struck me very profoundly was the sense of boundary making. So the kind of boundary between different kinds of ownership and responsibility, or between the perceptible and the imperceptible, and the two, I think, being very related in both papers. I think in Guillermo's presentation, I think what came up very strongly is this idea that the way in which the boundaries between the public and the private are occupied, perhaps because they are contested, that the boundaries move and change as people struggle over them. In a sense, the kind of boundary itself became something that was thick and in some ways indeterminate in terms of who controls it, or in the if we take the kind of metaphor of the garden, who cultivates it. Yeah, I mean, something that struck me as well about the image of the bridge being a shelter, of people kind of occupying the space beneath the bridge, which is something you also see in the context of cities like Los Angeles. Is what kind of public space is this? Is this a kind of classic image of the public sphere as a civic space, or is it the idea of the public as that which is not private, as merely a kind of negative image of the private sphere? That for people with limited means to make a home in the city, they have to find those spaces that are not owned by private interests. And in a sense, I know this is very important also to the context of, say, ideas of public space in a country like India, which is what I know better, where the public sphere and public space has always actually been a space that excludes many populations in the city. And so to actually claim space as public means to find those spaces which are neither kind of regulated by the state or kind of maintaining private interests. And so you see how people actually kind of occupy the interstices in between spaces. Yeah, I mean, and I think in terms of the metaphor of the garden, clearly, like artists make new spaces visible for the context of the research of the Fluvial Metropolis project by occupying them, or by recognizing already existing forms of occupation in cities. You know, and as both papers suggest, the edges of water bodies can be quickly appropriated for development. And I think maybe, as was suggested, I think in Jeremy's paper, you know, the idea of putting the piece of public art in public space. Art has often led the way, however unwittingly, in paving the way for real estate development of peripheral urban spaces, as you mentioned. So I wonder how, for instance, the idea of gardening introduces other forms of responsibility over the cultivation of urban edges and boundaries, if we kind of push this metaphor a bit. Who gardens? While cultivation suggests a field that is prepared for development, this kind of garden seems to resist such an outcome. So there's something heretical at work in the art practices we've considered today, which I think manages edges and in-between spaces, but stops short of their development by either private capital or state investment. So, you know, I think in the context of the Adronel project, the way we've been talking about water over the last series of workshops is as a space, is something that we can occupy. But, you know, I also want to think about these other scales and times, about the fact that water seeps into invisibility when it percolates into the ground, that it contains toxins and taste that we cannot see, which are much bigger than the edges of a single lake or river. We carry it with us in our bodies, as I mentioned earlier. It spills over, which Guillermo showed us images of. It also dries up or is displaced with sediment. It changes over time. Does the instability of water over time and space point to an equally unstable idea of the public or the common? So I wonder how a public of water is also different than other publics, and wanted to think together about what are its times and scales. So I think we can open up the discussion now. I'm sure people have many other questions since there's so much synchronicity between the presentations.
Taking up a discussion that we had earlier this week, Guillermo and I, in relationship to a presentation that we made about Siga, which is about public space. And correct me if I get any of this wrong, but one of the very important kind of takeaways from Guilherme's talk was the notion that in Brazil, or the argument that in Brazil, public space has always been a residue rather than a kind of organizing generator, let's say. And I think, you know, yesterday I was on Paulista walking, and Paulista, because this, I'm not sure how many years it's been open on Sunday, but it's relatively, yeah. So this is the second time I've been there, and it is much, much, much more animated than the last time I was here. And it really is this extraordinarily vibrant public space in its use, as is the Minhoco. And both of those, to me, seem like they present something that is the opposite of the notion of an occupation. Because both of them are in transit. I mean, what you do in Paulista is walk, and you go. You don't actually occupy, you transverse. And in that sense, it seems that water, the river, suggests this other kind of epistemology, which is not spatial but is transversal and durational. And that seems to me to be particularly interesting. The whole word occupy, the term has become, we see it right now primarily through a kind of progressive inflection because of since Occupy Wall Street and all of the occupations that have happened since that. But of course it also has the colonial inflection that precedes it. And so to think of the river as an epistemology for thinking public space through this transversal way, this seems to me to be very apparent in at least my own experience.
Good. Yes, let's try to continue our conversation in this sense and from your inputs. I agree totally with you this view. And we in Princeton, the previous workshop, we started also to discuss some issues about this absence and the loss of public sphere in Brazil, and expanding this conversation to this point of from Hélio Oiticica's works in the 60s and 70s and our situation now. What I think Oiticica was super smart to understand and to transform it in terms of his art was exactly that. He decided not to work on public spaces, so doing art for squares or parks, but for wastelands by one side, and by the other side bringing subjectivity and domesticity to museums or art galleries, right? So doing works, for example, the nests in MoMA in 1970, the nests where people could go inside and just being there in the cells and doing sex, for example, inside the MoMA gallery. So this was a scandal, but I was very impressed when I saw a recording by Vitor Conte, the North American artist, saying that for him to see this possibility of crossing public and private in an artwork, it was very powerful. And it was a kind of Brazilian contribution to art at that moment. And I understood many things after that. I think it's really true that maybe only a Brazilian artist or a South American artist could be the one who was able to bring this other possibility of understanding public sphere with the contributions of subjectivity and bringing things that belongs to another world. And after that, creating a possibility of re-understanding the public through this lens. And this is exactly because of we here in Brazil, and this was the moment of the worst moment in the dictatorship period. We don't have this sense of public, so we can change it through the private, but the private in a positive way, in this sense. So this is something, and when you talk about Paulista Avenue now and Minhocão, I think in the same way. We don't have true public spaces, but now we are transforming other spaces in public sometimes, because there is this zeitgeist now in the world, but in Brazil, when now our citizens, we want to have public space. And this is new, I think. New in terms of, because São Paulo is known as a city where you can live in gated communities,
going every time by car and shopping inside malls. So you don't need public space. It's like Los Angeles in this sense. But something is changing now. And this is what is nice in the middle of this big nightmare we are living now.
I think that the question of how to theorize this public space and the usefulness of the river as a metaphor is quite urgent, because I think on the one hand, if you understand the public space purely through an old model of a static occupation, it doesn't allow you to understand the transversal nature of this public space as it's actually being generated right now in the last few years. So, what is the policy that would correspond to it? To create a permanent plaza within the middle of Paulista, or to extend the possibility of walking to more avenues in the city, for example? I mean, those are two very different understandings of how to encourage that public space to flourish.
It's true, and you were bringing the work of Graziella Kunsch, and Graziella is really a key figure for understanding Movimento Passe Livre, the free transport movement, and it's very important that this big movement in our politics and manifestations in the streets really started with a movement, a small movement for transportation, and for us it was very new, because our agenda for social movements from the 60s was every time for housing. So housing and housing, social housing, and of course it's important, but when we could see such an important movement talking about transportation, it was something new. New, and in this crossing you are mentioning of transportation and public space. It's another comprehension of public space. Through transportation, the right of the city, the right of the people to come on the weekends, for example, to the city centers, to these public spaces like Avenida Paulista.
No, I mean, one of her point, of the activists is that in order to access any other rights, you have to have the right to transport. How can you access free healthcare if you don't have the right to arrive there? And around the time of the manifestations, also with the Rolezinhos, for the Americans, which were groups of young working class youth who were mobilizing to appear in places like malls, and were prevented from doing so. And so the right to circulate, who has the right to circulate, I think is a really critical way to rethink the specificity of the politics of nourishing a public space in Brazil. And the river seems to be a perfect metaphor of that, because it's always in flux. It's necessarily in flux, and it can never be. The only way one could imagine actually occupying it entirely would be to transform it entirely into capital. Through private interest, which is, of course, I'm sure people want to do. They want, the people who are going to profit from the flood water crisis are the ones who are involved in water.
It's another kind of occupation. It's another kind of occupation. But it's interesting because the kind of, what you see in some of the pictures you're showing, the way in which rivers are already occupied, like the map, what you don't see in the map of the park, right? Is that there's this other, there's something already there. There's a way in which that space is already a space of actually mobility for people in terms of making a life in that city, right? So, what was I gonna say? It's in a sense to kind of recognize. I think to recognize that that's already.
Big movements of activism now in Brazil is happening in Belo Horizonte from 4 or 5 years, and it's called Praia da Estação, so beach of the station, it would be literally. There they have the Praça da Estação, so it's the square of the station. It's the old train station with a square just in The mayor decided to finish this process of use for people using this square for riots, and he created bureaucracy laws to obstruct the use of the space. So after that, the population decided to occupy every Saturday this space as it is a beach. Because in Minas Gerais, Belo Horizonte is the capital of Minas Gerais, they don't have beach. So they cover the rivers and they don't have coast. So for that, they just decided, it's symbolic, they decided to do this big movement, calling like it was Rio de Janeiro, because the Rio de Janeiro sidewalk of the beach is really our paradigm of public space in Brazil. It's the most successful public space in terms of use. So for this activist movement, they decided to create a space for leisure, incorporating the water. So every Saturday they call for a truck with water to go there to bring water for people using where. Yes. So this is one side. This is recuperating water in like an imaginary of leisure. The other side is, I think, for us, many times, like these floating trees in São Paulo by Hector Zamora. The artists, they can work with aggressivity, dealing with negativity in terms of reacting with this violent process in the city. Architects in general works more with positivity because we design, so we have to plan and to propose good transformations. But sometimes artists and architects, they can work together with positivity and negativity in some sense, with the same goal. So I think Hidroanel is, in this sense, a positive comprehension of how the rivers could come back. Because we don't remember, we never see our rivers as rivers. When we live in São Paulo, they are invisible. Maybe this is a connection important to talk about.
Yeah, I was really impressed by the two presentations and the overlaps and the links. I mean, we know relationship. So I also was happy with Irene bringing as a closing statement last year's speaker, because of the example you showed of the two towers. What impressed me is the YouTube video and the fact that the work seemed to walk away from the museum that was opened by the curator and move into a completely different realm and into something that's going to be, that would be an occupation, and also that kind of marginal role of water in the construction itself. That is, without the water you couldn't build that building. So, which is a reflection. That is, we think of construction as piling up bricks or cement or whatever, but water is crucial for building. And so that's one comment. The other one is that it made me think about the difference between 2008 and 2017. And the fact I was happy that your video didn't work and that we have to go to YouTube. Because it also brought up the issue of a very different condition now when you said that we didn't have cell phones at that time and we need to go to the maps. And it also made me think of something that Irene mentioned, all the Occupy movements, which would not have been possible without the cell phone and social media. So I wanted to ask you both to what extent that radically changes our notions of what we've been discussing, public space or private space, especially because obviously private space is going to disappear at this point. Because of something that Julie Butler said about it, well, she was very active in the Occupy industry. And she said that you could not see it just as the people there, obviously without the police, that wouldn't happen. Without that infrastructure of media and internet and all these people working in other places, connecting with them, that wouldn't happen either. And so that made it possible to see Occupy and even Tahrir Square afterwards as the public space being now.
First.
Hmm?
First. Just to remember.
Yeah.
Came after.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, sure. Thanks for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they're not so close that they sometimes mix them up. But no, what I was going to say is that they look like redefining the public as the two sides of the same coin. It's not the same that we had 10 years ago. So I wanted to ask you to what extent, I mean, if you have any comments about it, because we didn't discuss that other dimension of public space because you were both talking about the pre-cell phone art.
Yes.
Well, one thing that's super interesting about Occupy Wall Street, if you want to look now for videos of Judy Butler or Cornel West giving talks, what happens, you can find them on YouTube, and so you have an infinite archive of possibility on YouTube. But of course, one of the things that Occupy was about was the definition of public space that is policed not just physically, but in terms of sound. So you're not allowed to use a megaphone. This is one of the ways in which people shut down public space at the level of sound. And so the people's microphone, the people's mic, was one of the ways, an archaic technology of amplification. So yes, maybe they mobilized through cell phones, but in order for Judith Butler to give a speech, she had to do it through this technology of the people's mic in which you simply repeat, which is here. And so I always found that incredibly amazing that you have, various kinds of technology that are overlapping and that require one another. The policing of public space at the level of sound is not something I was aware of, right? But these are the ways in which public discourse is actually shut down, is through the level of how loud something can be.
What you just mentioned reminds me of a conversation we called Foster, where we were discussing art and architecture, which has always been one of the issues or questions for him. And I was, in a way, we were discussing how slow and archaic architecture still is, even if we play with computers and with fabrication and all that stuff, as compared to art. And he said, well, that's perhaps the strength of architecture. This slowness and the archaic nature, that we're still putting bricks on top of each other or, piling up things.
When I was thinking about this,
materiality, which is what we're
yes,
for very.
Because, for example, when in 1996, Rosalind Krauss and Yves Langlois, they curated an important exhibition at Beaubourg, Pompidou, called Formless. So for that exhibition, they were working after Bataille's writings. And for Bataille, the object of attack was architecture, because architecture was the embodiment of the establishment, in this sense. So when you want to attack the power, you have to symbolically attack architecture, buildings. So Bastille in Paris, revolution starts demolishing buildings. And now, if you have to consider Bataille in our moment, it would be, if you attack a building, it's nothing. You have to attack Google or Amazon, I don't know. You should be a hacker in terms of this. I think there were a displacement of
On the other hand, there is.
But let me intervene at this point, because what I really struck by both of your talks is the fantasy, not the fantasy, the fantasticness of political engagement, political literacy, the artists that you're presenting to us. And I really want to talk a little bit about Henri Lefebvre and his blindness. I know his work quite well and have used this blindness, but he's really attacking architects, and he's really attacking city planners who are blind and cannot see what is on the ground. And what I wanted to ask you is it only, I have many questions to ask you, but is it the presence of the wealth of poverty in your presence, in your everyday life, even if you are driving in an automobile and living in a gated community in the South, that we don't have in the North, that we have lost it, that we can transform the Hudson River into the most expensive territory that exists in the world? When it was a few years ago, I had students who were taking photographs of the illicit goings-on the Hudson River. And just because the highway wasn't built in 1972, the money was spent. Now we have a lovely Hudson Park, and thank goodness to the wonderful rich people who put together the Friends of the High Line, and so on and so forth. But I do remember going through the meat market, because I live in the area, so I do remember going through the meat market in the 90s when the galleries first and the fancy shops first became moving into that. And women were walking like this, it smelled of meat still. And why would anybody put a gallery here? It stinks, it stinks. Well, it doesn't stink anymore, but it stinks of exactly what you're talking about. The fact, the moment that the riverfront begins to be valuable, then we have the real estate sharks that come in, and it's only the artist who can look at that negativity and do something really positive with it, because architects, I don't think can. They actually facilitate that. So I hope that the architects would debate me and say, no, you're wrong. There is a point where you just said maybe the negativity and the positivity can come together, but I wonder, can they? So, you know, and I actually, the question is it the wealth of the poor people that we can watch on YouTube, all of us, and see that? See the poverty and the dealing in the mud and the materiality of it, but we don't really touch it. You know, we see it from afar. We are blind. We are blinded by that luminosity of being present, but being so distant. And you talk about empathy, but is it almost a blindness of empathy when we're watching it from so far away? Anyway, there are lots of questions I think you raised. I'm hoping somebody will debate them.
Yeah.
Well, I remember a lecture Arthur Drexler gave at the Fund Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. I was studying Kurt and Anthony that's next month. Diana put together a small exhibition at Cooper Union to celebrate the 50 years of the foundation of the institute. So in one of our programs called Moraes Pan, they invited Drexler, who was the successor of Johnson and Coleman, and he gave a lecture that ended by saying, we architects are servants, which is with what in a way Cristina just reminded us. But I still would go back to the conversation with Tal Foster and feel that because our architects occupy a very, which I think is a very hybrid but also undefined territory and field where there are possibilities also for contacts with artists, and we know that these days artists are also very close to being servants of the power. So in a way I think that in both fields there have been desertions in opposite directions. And I think that architects who still, I mean, and that's one of the things I want to discuss this afternoon, actually, because I find that, you know, in academia and even in the place that's perhaps the epitome of what one would define as conservative, as Princeton University, that students, when they're still in the late teenage years of 20 years, and they don't really know what the implications are of what they're doing, they sometimes push those boundaries and produce statements that obviously, you know, I would say would be impossible to materialize or realize, but somehow overlap with some of the issues.
But let me go further.
And then,
let me go further with it. Architects can be political. They don't want to be political. They deny that their buildings have effects. So maybe you could talk a little bit about this building. When it was built, tell the students who have seen it for the first time, when it was built, and the politics, a little bit of the politics that are around this building. Because architecture is very political. It most of the time doesn't admit it, doesn't admit its collusion, and doesn't admit that it couldn't be non-collusion.
well, so, Christine, that's why I mentioned Drexler, because you had someone who is at the center of ideological power, and he ends this conference admitting the collusion with the ruling class, you could call it.
Well, I mean, to be the curator of architecture at the Modern Museum in the 1970s, most conservative Rockefeller, so on, exactly. Collusion is extreme.
Well, that's what I brought
as you can tell us. And
succeeding,
you know, I mean, it doesn't come out of just a meeting at the Institute, and it doesn't come out, I mean, when I mean the blindness of Henri Lefebvre is that you don't bring in the content, you pass on history as if it was a moment of personal history, a moment, but not the institutionalized history that goes along with it. And that, it seems to me, is what you're doing by presenting to us with the ideas of blindness, with the ideas of uncanny, with the ideas, you know, you are bringing in much more than simply the artist wanted to put trees that went over here and so forth.
You know, Christine,
but I've asked so many questions and I don't have any answers to my questions.
Well, I have one more comment, okay? To go back to this opposition of architecture versus art, I was extremely interested in that addition to the building, in that construction. And what caught my attention was the fact that there was a bathroom. And it brought back also something that Richard Serra said, who always hated architecture, who said, well, the difference between architecture and sculpture is that we don't have to deal with pipes. Okay? And what I thought was really radical about that addition is that there was a bathroom there. And an artist would not have done that. So there you have another way of looking at this, you know, dilemma and the relationship and the antagonism, which I think is real, the antagonism between art and architecture, in the same way as I always said this, the antagonism between architecture and the city. That is basically, you know, it's what I call the eternal fantasy of architects, you know, of somehow being able to domesticate the city, which is obviously being a fantasy, and the city constantly rejecting architecture. So for me, what I would say is that when we put together art, architecture, and urbanism, we're really looking at major tensions or antagonisms, I would call them. And I think it's interesting what Christine is bringing up, because in a way, you know, we don't want to pacify those antagonisms, we want to work with them.
The expression pacify is interesting to think about, because something that strikes me a lot many times is that for us here in this faculty, for example, but for architects in general, when we design a public space, in general, we think we try to think of public space as a base for peace, in terms of pacification of the conflicts. In Rio, yes, they transformed it in a name for political strategy in favelas. But if you consider a comprehension, a materialistic dialectic comprehension of the society, you see that the society is based on conflicts. And if you want to pacify everything, it's totally ideological. So that's why many artists like this floating trees over the river. You don't have to pacify anything. And for architects also, we have to work considering the possibility of dealing with public spaces, not pacifying, but bringing up the idea that there are conflicts. And we have to deal with conflicts, mainly in the so-called third world and South America. This is a big difference.
One question I have is whether your student that you sent to me to talk with my students when we were here, we were looking at the Museum Bucci, Dr.ª, as an example of a place that did not try and pacify conflict. But one question is architecture then stuck in the role of producing an allegory of conflict, which becomes, static and doesn't actually do any kind of generative work? One of the things, to go back to Oiticica, this question of bataille as anti-architecture, one of the central, very useful concepts that Oiticica put forward is the subterranean, which he understood specifically in relationship to subdesenvolvido, underdeveloped. But the subterranean for him is always constructive in orientation. And so it combines a sense of antagonism with a sense of the constructive. And so in that sense, perhaps architecture and art are not ontologically in conflict. It's a configuration of how to understand their relation.
But at the end, just one comment. The case of movies is not a good example for that, in fact, because it's totally pacified. It's in a very rich neighborhood, blocked by fences, so it's, unfortunately, it's not a public space. But for a stronger example, you can look for MASP in Avenida Paulista. That's the one. There you can see what I am trying to say. This is a real public space, maybe the most successful in the city.
Why? Why would you say that?
It is because in Avenida Paulista is a free space in the ground floor, and yes, totally open, and so there you have it. Since the first drawings by Elena Bobardi, you see the possibilities of occupation with very different circuses, for example, flea market, musical shows, and political manifestations, and it really happens. So the dynamic of the city.
The flow of people, allowing the flow and not containing behind the walls, allowing this river of people.
Yes.
If you want to talk about it in terms of food.
But I think it's also the genius of Lena Bobardi is actually to have opened a window on São Paulo. And it goes back to Angelo's presentation of São Paulo as a city on two levels, which it's very difficult to perceive. That is, you either perceive it when you're driving, which you don't, because when you drive you don't see it, and unless you know. So I think there is that other possibility for architecture, which is to produce knowledge on the city and to have this very different relationship. And that's what I'm saying. I think it's pure genius for her to have opened up that window where you see what São Paulo really is, because you don't see it as that. place. You are either here or okay? And that's the moment when the whole thing opens up. And so for me, that's a unique moment where, you know, art, architecture, and the city come together.
Yes. Thinking about Cristina's comment, I want to tell you, for example, regarding the relationship between architecture and politics. For example, when we think about Le Corbusier's idea of avoiding revolution with wood architecture.
Right.
Yes, in the sense, thinking about Brazilian architecture, for example, we can think Oscar Niemeyer by one side. Every time Niemeyer said, architecture will not transform anything. I do architecture for fun. If we want to transform the society, you should go and do a revolution. Vila Nova Artigas, who designed this building, by the other side, he decided to think architecture as possibility of revolution. So incorporating the conflicts of the society and of the materiality in the form. So these are totally different and opposite ways of thinking. And of course we can go further, and nowadays to look for this collective of young groups that are going to the peripheries and working on the reality, right? Not deciding to be liberal architects on their offices waiting for a call for a job, for a client, but being involved in the complexity of the reality. I think when your comments goes this way. Yeah. In this sense, it's close to the artists, the collectives working together.
I think it's interesting too today because we see these two different ways in which water becomes both a space and infrastructure and a metaphor, in the sense both of it being a kind of line and a series of boundaries that are contested, in which I think architects are not necessarily kind of guarantors of providing that line, but actually forming alliances with the kind of people that occupy those spaces, actually as actually being political actors in potentially maintaining the invisibility of those spaces or making them visible when they work for developers, for instance. And on the other hand, the idea of the space under mass being a window, a visual field in space, in which the architect is charged with kind of preserving or maintaining or creating a space of conflict that supports conflict in different ways. We see these kind of two different ways in which water actually is productive as a kind of metaphor for politics and the kind of work that architecture does.
Well, hopefully we'll continue the discussion on this afternoon.
Yeah. There is, we can listen to America to be announced. I think it's good to have a break.